Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brandi Colander. I'm a principal with the Raben Group. And we are gathered here today to pay homage to Fannie Lou Hamer and to spend some time talking to an incredibly thoughtful academic who's really unpacked her life and told her story through a different lens, the Reverend Karen Crozier, Ph.D. Karen?
Thank you, Brandi and the Raben Group, for this opportunity to join you today. It is a delight and a pleasure to be here to share with you and your viewing audience on the life, legacy, the living example that she was both then and now, of Fannie Lou Hamer.
Absolutely. So we're gonna first spend a little bit of time talking about you, and I want to tell our audience that this is a session that it's the kind of treat you would allow yourself to indulge in towards the end of the week. We know it's the middle of the week, but this is a soul-soothing session. I've had the pleasure of having some sidebars with Karen, and she really is a joy. She's very thoughtful about these issues. But we want to spend a little bit of time hunkering in. So I would encourage you to go get your cup of something hot. I would encourage you to make sure that you're active on our chat, send us questions. What we record today will be live on the Raben Group's YouTube page. My name is Brandi Colander again. I'm a principal with the Raben Group. We are a strategic communications and public affairs shop headquartered in Washington, D.C. We sometimes have the joy and privilege of having conversations with influencers and thought leaders like Karen today. So before I ask you to tell me a little bit about sort of your academic path and journey, I wanted to highlight a couple of things, just factoids that are interesting about you. You are possibly the first scholar of religion and theology to write a book on Fannie Lou Hamer. You enjoy cooking and eating paleo meals, and you are a two-time Athletic Hall of Fame inductee, high school and counting. Tell us a little bit about what has allowed you to dig so deep academically. What was your path, Karen?
Well, thank you for the question, Brandi. My path into the academy began out of a sense of an urgent divine call to understand who I was in the world and how I was to respond as a person who grew up in a Black Baptist church. In undergraduate in UCLA, I sensed I was called to the pastorate, but because certain denominations and local congregations do not believe in women as leaders, as pastoral minister leaders, and I had to sort of suppress that urge and calling until 10 years later, after undergrad, I landed in a particular church where there was a freedom to pursue who I was as female, as Black, of who God has called me to be in the world. And once I said yes in that moment, it became clear to me that you are now going to pursue your academic call in theology, religion, or divinity school, and you are not going to pursue it in applied linguistics. I had did a master's degree in early childhood education. I was a former as well second grade teacher and seventh grade algebra teacher, so some more factoids. And I did my master's thesis on Ebonics in 1996, before Oakland's school board policy came forth to address the issues that was happening to African-American students being pushed to the corner of the classrooms in our English learners programs. And so therefore, it was like a shift. Okay, I'm not going to be doing applied linguistics. I'm going to be focusing solely on theology and religion. And I had no background, academic background in theology or religion, and had the support of a colleague's husband in teacher education who was a minister, and ended up at Claremont School of Theology back in 2000, 20 years ago. So had the opportunity while at Claremont to nurture a critical theology. And I say a critical liberatory theology because it spoke to the lived experience of people and not just beginning with abstract doctrine. And so therefore, that opened up the opportunity for me to integrate the program I chose, Theology and Personality, or Practical Theology. And another layer of that is focus on religious education, how you bring research, experience, and theory and theology together in a meaningful way in order to help people to construct their understanding of making meaning of who the divine is in the world and how we are to respond to that. Wow. So I will stop there.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. That's the baseline. So I'm going to set you up a little bit. Fannie Lou Hamer was born on October 6, 1917. So she would have turned 103 yesterday. So this is a celebratory moment. This truly is a moment of homage that you have lifted up through your work in writing this book. And there's a piece that I want to read and ask you to kind of provide some additional context. But I think it really speaks to Karen, who she was and her early connection to land. So I'm quoting here. As the youngest of 20 children, 6 girls and 14 boys, in a sharecropping family and granddaughter of a formerly enslaved person of African descent, Fannie Lou was birthed into the 2-parent home of James Lee and Luella Townsend. To many Black rural Southerners, the sharecropping system was another form of slavery, of perpetual servitude. Fannie Lou recalls how she started picking cotton at the age of 6, when the landowner enticed her to pick at least 30 pounds of cotton a week in exchange for some food and candy items that he knew the young Fannie Lou loved from his store. She accomplished that goal and was compensated for her efforts, but then she was forced to pick twice as much the following week, and by the age of 13, she was picking 200 to 300 pounds of cotton. And so when I was reading through, some of the materials preparing for today, that landed with me on multiple fronts. As someone who has studied the environment and feels her own connection to land, as the grandchild of a grandmother who's about to turn 96 and was a sharecropper, these sort of generational tetherings, they run deep, Karen. And so I just wanted to frame that up for our audience today and see if you could put Fannie Lou in context as we explore a few areas together.
Yes, thank you, Brandi, for that intergenerational connection, because that's what Fannie Lou Hamer was naming as well, as far as her mother, her grandmother, and the whole family was responsible for tilling the land. And as we know of having 20 children, when slavery ended and white slave owners did not have access to getting exploited labor from the continent of Africa, Black families were somewhat forced to produce more babies, because the more field hands they had, they would get meagerly compensated, $50 per child. So you look at the fertility issues of what it meant to have a large family to help out in the land. And then the reality was that sharecropping did not produce life for the family, because everything that they did produce went back to the landowner. And that's what Fannie Lou Hamer had shared as well within her family, that it had too many its in it. That the Black family would spend all the time picking it, chopping it, harvesting it, and then at the end of the day, who took it? The white slave owner. Or not the slave owner, the landowner at the time. And so therefore, she was in a perpetual state of servitude beginning at the age of 6, and realized that the land and her labor were significant to the reality of life, and that if she kept in that situation, that there would never be liberation or freedom for her people. So within that context, that she became aware of her relationship and development, that the land was important, and how do we pursue our own land? Because she also knew that the state of Mississippi officials wanted her and Black people out of the state, while the federal government had considered Black folks a surplus. So immigration issues even. So she was critiquing the reality of how the US during her lifetime of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s were bringing in European immigrants while saying that they had no resources to care for those who were descendants of US slaves, enslaved folks here in the US of African descent, to care for them. So she was critiquing that as well.
And just, you said a lot there. You said all of the it's, all of the it's. You said land, labor, life, and liberation. And that to me really encompasses a lot of what sick and tired of being sick and tired really embodies, right? It's doing the math in your head and realizing that something is not adding up here for me in terms of the service of what I'm putting in versus the ROI, right? So I want to understand what inspired you, in all of the musings that you come across and the potential folks that you want to dig deeper on. Why Fannie Lou Hamer?
Great question, Brandi. Fannie Lou Hamer. Yes. Fannie Lou Hamer appealed to me on multiple levels. I knew that she was involved in electoral politics, and that was the main thing of voting rights and voter registration that many scholars had already written on, whether it was chapter length books or chapter length contributions or journal articles. But I felt like she had done something more. And it was through the work of Leah Williams, who Servants of the People, where she did different chapters of African-American civil rights leaders of the 1960s. And Fannie Lou Hamer was one among many of both women and men who were able to bring what Leah Williams was named as the servant leadership model. So she was taking Greenleaf's model and applying it to the leadership of African-American people. And Fannie Lou Hamer, she gave a much broader scope. And in my class, honors leadership class, I had my students at the undergraduate level begin to explore the significance of this servants of the people. And Fannie Lou Hamer was one of them. And as I began to dig deeper, and we were dealing with environmental issues, Fresno has, where I'm from, where I currently reside, has greatest concentrated poverty in the nation, has the highest, worst air quality in the nation. And so I was looking at all of these things that are happening to us environmentally. But what was the labor to where we were creating or being proactive in the context? So I began to look at, I found out, she was a leader and co-founder of the Freedom Farms. She started a Head Start for our babies. She worked with the National Council with Dorothy Height in order to create what was known as Wednesdays in Mississippi. WIMS, where women from the North came and worked with women from the South of different racial, economic backgrounds, as well as religious. And I said, wow, Fannie Lou Hamer's life, her favorite song was This Little Light of Mine. Her life and light was so much profound and prominent than just the voter registration, because it began with when she realized the terror they received when they tried to register to vote, that she had to create another base, another arm. And that's where the economic and land development and procurement came into play in the process. So in short, Fannie Lou Hamer was one who was of the rural poor, who had something to say, who was of Christian faith that had to be amplified from my perspective in order to have a more broader critical look of who she was and what she has to offer, both then and now.
I appreciate that. I want to unpack it a little bit. I want to first, because we know this sick and tired of being sick and tired quote. I want to first contextualize her role in voting and democracy And I want you to frame that out because we've alluded to it, but I want to bring the audience along. And then we're going to sort of split off and talk more about land, environment, agriculture. I mean, all of the different ways that she started to show up that led you to write this book. But please first set the context around her role in democracy and voting. And if you don't mind, Karen, I think it's important for our audience to know it wasn't just that she used her voice. She was beaten. She was tortured. Mm-hmm. She was more than inconvenienced. So if you don't mind framing that out, that would be wonderful.
Yes. The voting rights, she states in her own words, it was in 1962. She did not know she had a right to vote until she was 44 years old, where she went to a mass meeting in August of 62 that was put on by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, as well as Martin Luther King's SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as Farmers Corps, Congress of Racial Equality. So these three groups were engaging Mississippians, rural, poor, Black Mississippians, on helping them to understand their right to vote. And they did a presentation in William Chapel Baptist Church. And Fannie Lou Hamer went on that night. And when she heard the first sermon from that context that came by Reverend James Bevel, as he preached on knowing the signs of the time, and she was like, wow, I can interpret what this time means to step into this space to go register and vote, because I didn't know I had the right to vote somebody out who was not representing my interests. I didn't know I had an opportunity to say I disagree with the perspective or with the policy that's continuing to oppress me and my people. I didn't know. And so I see the signs of the time, as this preacher has told me, and now they're asking me who wants to go to vote. And they had to travel 26 miles to the county state house. So it wasn't like just jumping in their car. They had to get a bus. 18 of them raised their hands. And she said, there was no need to be scared. They had been trying to kill me all along. So I need to take this next step. So we all know the story. They went to try to register to vote because Black people in Southern states had to deal with literacy tests. They had to deal with poll taxes. And when they got there she said she had never seen so many policemen and dogs in her life. They were waiting for them to scare them away. And SNCC field organizers Charles McLaurin notes how everyone was intimidated on that bus, and they just sat there once that school bus had landed at the Indianola courthouse. And then Fannie Lou Hamer began to sing, and it helped to calm the fears. It helped to strengthen up their spines. It helped them to take that next step to get off that bus and walk in and try to register to vote. Now, none of them were successful on that day. And when they tried to get back on the bus to go back home, they were stopped by the police officer in the State Highway Patrol and charged with riding the bus with the wrong color.
Just ridiculous. I mean, Karen.
Fields in Florida when there was no money, in order to help people to survive the winter months when they had no work in their local homestead. But on that day, as she says, they
And I think we may have lost Karen.
She told him he wasn't ready, but she had been ready a long time. And so therefore she knew she had to go, because he told her if she don't go, if she don't take her name off that registration list, because they was told on, they was communicated, that's why they would write their names and ask which plantation they're from when they would try to register to vote. So in short, that commenced the beginning of her departure. She left her family at that time, and she also had to go live with another family when she was barely missed a drive-by where 16 bullets came after her on September 10th in 1962.
And I appreciate you. The story continues, but I just want to pause here because um, you're lifting up so many unfortunate parallels to today, right? I hear you talk about Fannie Lou not knowing until 44 that she had a right to exercise in our democracy by voting. And you hear about efforts like what Bloomberg is doing to help formerly incarcerated and returning citizens recognize that there is a period of time where they can now re-engage in our democracy. There is a way to make sure that people can actually vote who are just unaware of their ability to exercise their right to vote. And so sadly, Karen, in 2020, we still have pockets of our democracy who we have not made clear that they too have a way to exercise their vote. And then I'm also hearing you talk about the 26-mile voyage to be able to be told no. And the generational dynamics that happen. I think about my parents, my mother, my grandmother had to live with another, basically allow my mother to live with another family so that she could get a job that would allow them economically to advance us generationally, right? And so we are making hard choices that are very, very close to where we are today. And I wanna spend a little bit of time um, talking about what you think Fannie Lou today would say of democracy, would say of the way that we are utilizing our voice and our vote. And then we can move on to some other topics.
Wow. I think in many ways she would say, baby, keep on keeping on, because I am familiar with your struggle regarding voter suppression and trying to access voting rights. She was running for office in the state of Mississippi. And when the Voting Rights Act had passed in 1965, because in Mississippi, many of the Black people were the majority in the ways that it was districted in the counties, but only maybe 2 to 3% were actually registered voters. But after Freedom Summer in 1964 and the passing of the Voting Rights Act, you had, wow, a greater chance now to enact your right. And then guess what happened? The powers that be redistrict the land and split up all the counties where there was a majority of African Americans, and therefore their votes became of less effectual towards the ends of exercising their power. So she called it, went to bed one night on one side and woke up the next morning on another side.
And those, I mean, the gerrymandering and those boundaries. Let's spend a little bit of time exploring what you think her inspiration was around agriculture, because she really was a leader in the environmental and sort of natural resource land management space. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate.
Right. As the quote says here, this is beautiful. The land has given us hope, dignity, and self-respect. And she goes on to say, cooperative ownership of land opens the door to many opportunities for group development of economic enterprises, which develop the total community rather than create monopolies that monopolize the resources of a community. Listen to what she says to a people that have been displaced through involuntary immigration, to a people who have been commodified on this land called the US, to a people who had to work the land but not benefit from their labor, who were the true tillers and keepers of the land. The land became a redemptive, hopeful experience when she was able to work with both Black and white organizations. One of her biggest funders within Wisconsin was Measure for Measure. And they were able, as well as she worked with young people who walked across America in their walkathon in order to generate funds to support Freedom Farms, which at its peak has 640 acres. So not only did it have cash crops, not only did it have subsistence crops, it also had vocational training for the people. It had quality housing for the people, affordable housing. And it also sent the surplus of food up north to those who had left the South in Chicago from Mississippi to go to Chicago in hopes for a better life up north or out west. The Freedom Farms Cooperative was also sent there to Chicago, as well as she had a pig bank where the piglets that each family would get a male and female pig, and then would have birth it, and then have their piglets, and then send the female piglet to another family that would be able to continue to generate food where they would have on their own. So it was both food security and economic security in cooperative land use and resources for liberation, empowerment, safety, and creativity for who they were as human beings as she was fighting against the voter suppression, the blight of food, as well as, we haven't even named this, the lack of access to quality health care.
And yes, all the things. And yes, and you are articulating in her agricultural works, her developing an enterprise of self-sufficiency, right? I mean, she really was, teaching the man to fish. She really was empowering and showing collective and cooperative economics within her own community. I wonder, Karen, if we could talk a little bit about how you think Fannie Lou would articulate environmental justice.
She would say, I am tending to the needs of the people in the place and space who are the neglected, the abandoned, the forgotten folks by governments and agencies who should be tending to them. And then providing them with the resources. So that's why she has started the Head Start, because the babies from 0 to 5 did not have a foundational education. She also critiqued the U.S. educational system because she said Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. She was saying that his Indian brother and his Black brother was already here, said, come on, man, and welcomed him. And so therefore, she was saying we need to challenge as well in our environmental justice ethic, the ways that education and misinformation continues to perpetuate this unjust system. And as well as looking at what Black people have done in contributing to the beauty of the habitat that we all live in and share, as well as understanding that when she called Senator Eastland, who was her most clearest arch rival, who was part of the KKK as well in the White Citizens Council. and he would get reimbursed from letting the land go for not producing. So having 5,800 acres and not having to produce and get compensated by the federal government. And she says something wrong with that, and you got thousands of Black folks starving from hunger and malnutrition. So she would see it as people, place, and space, and not being monopolized by the few or the oligarchs, the white male landowners. It's there for them too, but not just for them. So
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, you're hitting on something around federal resources and the fact that there is a system in place that was actually rewarding underutilization of the land, right? And her ability to try and harness with the resources she had without those resources, certainly not at scale, but what it did to allow other families to feel empowered. And so I wonder, Karen, just based off of your sort of analysis of her, what do you think made her effective as a leader? Why do you think people, lots of people have loud voices, but that doesn't mean people follow. What do you think Fannie Lou had that allowed people to invest in her and follow her lead?
One of the things that many of the major leaders of the civil rights movement who were male, Andrew Young of the SCLC, who was one of King's right-hand men, as well as a formerly departed John Lewis, they clearly articulated that she infused morality into politics, that she brought her own lived experience to bear that was able to resonate with, connect with not only her fellow sufferers, but also to invite those who were not aware to become sympathetic to. At the 1964 Democratic National Convention, where she and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party made their testimony to unseat the 5 Dixiecrats regulars who had intentionally and systemically excluded Black voters from participating in the process. So they had thousands of pages of documentation of what they had did to follow the rules of the Democratic Party and what the 5 white men who were there as the delegates had not done to represent the Democratic Party. And it was during her testimony that it was clear that people were crying who were sitting on that credentials committee. And so her story that she had within her belly, and she also said that she had been praying for a time for God to open up a door, that she had been waiting for that moment. So when the moment came, she was ready. When SNCC came to Mississippi in 1962 in that chapel, in William Chapel Baptist Church, she was ready. So it was a combination of knowing her story, having it resonate with others, and also willing to speak a truth to where she's willing to work across boundaries. Although she was a Christian and poor, she worked with Jews and Catholics and Protestants and atheists and humanists. She worked with women, men. She worked with the educated, young students, as well as the miseducated and uneducated older people. So you see the diversity of barriers that she was able to transcend because she was in tune with why she was doing what she was doing and towards the ends that she was working for. And I think that was the difference for her.
And you shared, I mean, I feel like she's just fiercely an advocate of her humanity at every turn, right? In different pockets of her life, she's had impact, but it is always her defending her humanity. And I was wondering, Karen, what do you think influenced her? I mean, the one of 20 children, I'm one of 2. I cannot even imagine the grit you develop, the sort of intuition that you develop, and self-sufficiency you develop when you're one of 20. What do you think shaped her fortitude?
Yes. In the book, I discuss in the opening chapter, how was her family that shaped her. Her mother was a strong influence in her life. Currently, she even has the Smithsonian Folklore Tradition and Music has songs my mother taught me. And so that reality of seeing her mother model strength, her mother being there to support and protect her, as well as her father, who had wit and who was also a preacher and who also was one who was a businessman. And so she saw the ingenuity, even though that they was poor and oppressed, she still saw them creating a way to care for 20 children. So look at this. So she sees her two parents who did not have enough care for her 20 sisters and brothers, her 19 other sisters and brothers. And then it was the alternative redemptive education that she received from SNCC, as well as from SCLC, Septima Clark, and Ella Baker, who was the women behind the architect in preparing the enslaved, miseducated, undereducated Black rural folks to understand your rights, to understand how to read, to understand how to exercise your humanity in the world. And so therefore, those were the context and the resources and the safety nets around her. And then she also says the Black church. The Black church, she said 90% of the folks in Mississippi grew up in the church. And she said, I'm not ashamed of this. They taught me how to love. And this is the love that we have in our hearts, that I'm not coming down to a white man's perspective or white system's perspective and hate you because you hate me. I was taught to love, and I know the significance and power of love. And so therefore, that is what continued to shape and reshape her as she was able to appropriate all of those into her adulthood, when she finally was given a broader platform to say, I matter, we matter, and you matter too, because she was telling white folks, your freedom is shackled up to my freedom. So we are.
Say that again, Karen.
Yes. she was not afraid. She was telling our white sisters and others, your freedom is shackled up to my freedom.
I ask you to repeat it because it is one of the quotes, in prepping that it really does land a little differently today, right? Where we have a president who will not unequivocally disassociate himself from white nationalism, white supremacy. And so it is not to cast aspersions on any one demographic. It is to say that we literally have our leadership, our tax dollars, not the broader vote, but our president, who is not willing to denounce hatred of any kind, and what that's teaching our babies. And so you are only as strong as one another, and being able to make that very crystal clear, I think, is so important for her ability to transcend and for people to hear her message at a time where they weren't open to that type of thought. I really want to explore a little bit about the things that surprised you when I want to get into your book a little bit, and I want to hear you talk about the things that surprised you when you were recounting her story, her vision, her work, whether in the environmental space or any other sector. But what shocked you as you were doing your research, Karen, about her?
I don't think there was much shock. It was just more lament. As I had to often just step back and cry to see what they had to endure, and to honor the struggle, to know that we are still in it. It's not finished, but thanking her for what she did, what those alongside her did, and finding a way to say, how do I assume responsibility to continue what still needs to be done in my lifetime?
That's humbling. That's humbling. It is very humbling when you understand how people were willing to inconvenience themselves, and that's
Right.
very mildly. But when you look at one of the things I really respect and appreciate about the late John Lewis is that because he was so young at the time, and because they still allowed him to be in their swirl, in their rare, special air, he was then able to live so much longer and tell the stories and be able to, in our lifetimes, be a testament to how it was not that long ago. And so we cannot afford to forget, right? Because we can regress. This democracy is so fragile, right? And I feel like when you think about the literal torture that Fannie Lou Hamer endured, and the lack of resources and how much more we all have now, it is humbling, and I really respect that response. It's not shock, it's lament, because there's a lot of trauma that she absorbed on our collective behalf, and many of us are still absorbing it as we watch the news every day.
Right. And I want to add to that, in particular instances of when SNCC in on Black women's bodies, many people probably don't know that she had a forced sterilization. So she went into the hospital for a benign tumor and came out with her uterus gone, and it was not her consent. And then, as well as women who was involved in the movement of the 60s in Mississippi, when they would go to the clinics of a Black doctor, or black healthcare worker, they would see, and I don't even know what these were, health police prongs or thongs or something on their vaginal areas, and try to submit this work reports to the Department of Justice that never got any response. So it was rough to know that it was damaging to not only their minds and their physical bodies, but to our very wombs that we put on the line in order to see a different reality for this country.
I want to pull our audience in a little bit, Karen, and I want to thank you for your brain, your heart. We are joined today by John Milton Wesley, who is in the comments and is Fannie Lou Hamer's godson, and he wants to thank us for this conversation today. So I want to thank you, Karen. We have a couple of questions. The first is, what is the one lesson organizers and activists should take from Fannie Lou Hamer as the election nears? So I want to thank this audience. Can you hear me okay? It's up on the screen now. What is the one lesson organizers and activists should take from Fannie Lou Hamer as the election nears?
One lesson, get out there and vote and make your voice heard. And go knock on doors. Yes, go knock on doors. Don't give up, no matter what resistance or pushback you receive. Make it.
Yeah. And as we work with Karen, I will say, we've had recent reports from Department of Justice. There have been reports about just voter suppression.
To know that they have the right to vote, but also know that even once the vote is done, there's still work to do.
That's very true. There's work to do. And
once the vote is cast, and continue to engage with that, to see the long-term protracted vision to articulate that for the people so they know that they're doing more than just casting a vote.
And Karen, you're cutting in and out a little bit, but I'm just going to add on to that and say, I think one of the things we can take away from her insistence and her fearlessness is that it is worth you investing in not being intimidated by some of the tactics that we are all victims and falling prey to, whether it's through social media or, you know, armies of people that are going to be at voting sites. This is your right. This is your opportunity. Your voice needs to be heard, and we need everybody in the arena. So I'm going to move to another question. What role did Fannie Lou Hamer's faith play in the development of her politics of interdependency when we talk about your freedom is shackled to my freedom? Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes. She was in the Winona jailhouse. We had made reference to that earlier when she was tortured, when they was coming back from a SCLC citizenship training in South Carolina. And once they got back across the border in Mississippi, they stopped off at a restaurant to use the restroom and get some food. And the cops was there waiting for them. The police officers were there waiting for them. And she was, 5 of them were taken into the Winona jail where they were all tortured and beaten. And she had permanent kidney damage, a clot in her eye from that beating that was done by 2 Black male convicts who was forced to beat her. In that space, as she's recounting the story of what happened, she had told the jailer that she quoted Acts 17:26 and said, God has made of one blood all nations. So she was saying we are all interdependent coming from a divine source. So therefore, you're going to have to answer for this one day. You claim to be Christian, but let me share with you a biblical truth as I understand it, and that I still see my connection to you, even though you have done this to me. The jailer responded by saying, it's a damn lie. Abraham Lincoln said that. And so therefore, Fannie Lou Hamer came with the basic fundamental theology and faith that we all are creatures created by a divine parent, a same source that.
And Karen, as we work with the internet disruption, I want to also lift up John Milton Wesley, again, Fannie Lou Hamer's godson, who's joined us in the audience today. One of the lessons he wants to share is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And I think she is absolutely a testimony to her ability to demonstrate that someone who certainly had challenges beyond measure.
Right here, right now, in this land, on this soil that we call the U.S.
Thank you, Karen. We have another question from Whitney here. She says, thank you. What is your vision in light of analyzing Fannie's life? What do you think is possible in this moment? Possibilities, Karen, possibilities.
Wow.
Thank you, Whitney.
Thank you.
Yes.
One of the chapters is called Revolutionizing the Diversity Inclusion Paradigm. Fannie Lou's leadership for Jubilee and Black reparations. And so therefore, I believe what Fannie Lou Hamer had articulated, she was the only signature on the Black Manifesto that was written in 1969 and presented to white religious institutions of Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant descent to critique their complicity in the slave trade and segregation and the ways that they benefited from it. And she signed the reparations because she felt like the Black Manifesto, because we need to hold the church accountable as well as create new avenues of what it means to help Black people. And so I believe that this is it is a better time for us to understand and critique and transcend paradigms of diversity, equity, inclusion that didn't work for us. That she was naming, I don't want to be included in the system that already sees my demise. I want to transform that system, restructure the system to where we have a collective reality and not a monopolized reality, to where we have community decision making at the lowest level. And she was saying, no, not that the government doesn't have any responsibility at the national level, but we got to work together. Because she was of the belief, if it's not men and women in governments learning to talk, then it's going to be men and guns. So she sort of does a spin off what Malcolm X says, the ballot or the bullet. She was not necessarily a person who believed in violence as a way to our liberation and freedom as a nation and as a people, but it was more so understanding the reality of the conditions. If you're not heard, what will people do in order to be heard? How far will they go in order to be heard? And that's what she understood the young people as. So she was also a sympathizer of Black Panther Party, and to understand Stokely Carmichael's popularization of Black power, not to fear white people or not to make white people afraid, but to say, wow, we need to understand what is our political, economic, as well as social voice and responsibility to create a different world to where we can thrive too. Beautiful. So I think that is what Fannie Lou Hamer is pushing us today for, to see new possibilities of saying, no, I don't want to be included in a system that has already sees me as less than, or just making a space for me to be tokenized. I want to create something new. Are you ready? Let's go.
That's the possibility. That's the possibility. That's and being heard.
Revolutionize.
Yeah. Being heard, making sure that there are not pieces of our society that go so suppressed for so long that the alternative is a revolution, right? You don't have to start at revolution level if you listen to the people. And I wanted to spend just a couple more seconds, because we're getting towards the end of our time. Is there anything more that you wanted to say on her position on war and revolution specifically? You talked a bit about reparations, but are there any other pieces there that you want to lift up, or any other highlights of your book before we close out that you want to lift up?
Yes, thank you for that, Brandi. I think I just wanted to raise regarding the war stance during the time of her life. It was the Vietnam War in the 1960s, late 60s and 70s that the U.S. was involved in. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was the first group to express their resistance to the Vietnam War that preceded, as well as Martin Luther King's SCLC and King's more famous speech, the War on Vietnam. And so what Fannie Lou Hamer represents was that we need to take care of our domestic concerns, affairs, realities at home. And she said, why would we go up there and fight a racist war? They're not, if the Southeast Asians want communists, that is their decision. So she was consistent about local, national decision making, right? She cannot interfere with that, and knowing that, wow, all the resources that could be allocated to addressing poverty here in the US is now being allocated to fight a war that's not at our best interest neither, as a poor Black rural Mississippian. And so therefore, we must have a critical look at the ways that wars do not advance the common good, as well as understand the ways that wars are used um, to manipulate the people into thinking one way that is not true. So she was critical of that then, and we need to be mindful of the ways that wars are used today.
I agree. I agree. Thank you for that. For our audience, I want to thank you for joining us. This is just a sample of what you will get if you click on that ticker down below and purchase this book. There's a lot of really just incredible insight and stories that we have been privileged enough to listen to. Um, the heart and the mind of Dr. Karen Crozier today, and I want to thank you for the sincerity that you brought to this work, Karen. I feel like you really have allowed yourself to be sort of a blank page, and it's almost like you really have just been receptive to the things that made Fannie Lou her and given it life, and made it applicable today. I feel like there are so many parallels between land, labor, life, and liberation today that still resonate, which is amazing to me. So we pay homage to Fannie Lou Hamer, 103 strong. Um, and we pay homage to you, Karen, for your thoughts and your insights. And we want to thank everyone who took the time today to join us. And this will be live on our YouTube page, the Raben Group's YouTube page moving forward. We really would encourage you to look into this new book and continue to follow more good work on Jewel of Justice. Any final thoughts, Karen, before we close out?
Yes, I would just like to thank the Raben Group for this opportunity to have a real dialogue on the significance of Fannie Lou Hamer. And thank you, Brandi, for your leadership in the way that you was able to further amplify the significance of who she is and the work that is being offered unto the world from my opportunity to present this book unto us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all, and take good care. Continue to follow
Bye.
the group. Bye-bye.